Prime Minister Mark Carney is laying out his plan for Canada to be its own best customer. Today, the Prime Minister revealed more details on the Liberals' Buy Canadian policy as they try to use federal dollars to boost demand for tariff-strapped Canadian industry.
The world has become more dangerous and divided, and that decades-long process of an ever closer economic relationship between Canada and the United States is over.
Something shifted in Ottawa tonight. Something far deeper than a fiscal announcement or the familiar choreography of political theatre. It wasn't framed with grand gestures or wrapped in patriotic noise. Yet the impact of what happened is already radiating outward, altering assumptions that shaped North America for generations. In a room crowded with reporters, lenses blinking in restless bursts, Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't simply table a budget. He ended an era. Calm, composed, and deliberate. He delivered words that carried the gravity of a continental recalibration. Without hostility, without apology, Canada told Washington that its days of operating with American permission are over. It began quietly, almost disarmingly ordinary. Carney walked to the podium with his trademark restraint, the measured posture of a man who rarely reveals what he's about to do. He called the event a budget presentation. But within minutes the tone hardened, the politeness peeled away, and something unmistakable rose beneath the surface. Sovereignty spoken out loud. His opening phrase was so plain it could have passed unnoticed. "It's official," he said. Then he paused. A long, intentional pause that felt like a door closing. What followed froze the room. Canada's future is no longer tied to Washington's decisions. The IT wasn't designed for shock value. It wasn't a threat or a bargaining chip. It was clarity spoken with the finality of a nation that has reached its threshold. For decades, Canadian leaders had treated the U.S. like a gravitational force, something to orbit, to accommodate, to carefully navigate. But tonight, Carney stepped out of that orbit. Months of warnings about instability in Washington, about tariff threats floated like trial balloons, about late-night policy reversals that shook markets. Each had been building toward this moment. Dependence, he said, had become risk, and risk was now unacceptable. While Trump's team churned out its usual mix of conflict and unpredictability, Carney was constructing something else entirely behind the scenes. Not a counterattack, not an attempt to outmaneuver chaos with more chaos. He was designing a system that made the old game irrelevant. That system took center stage in the initiative he unveiled, Build Canada Homes. Most had assumed it was another housing plan, the kind governments introduce every election cycle. Jobs, construction, infrastructure, a ribbon cutting or two. But Carney's explanation revealed something far more ambitious. The program would be anchored by a new federal organization equipped with the financing, land access, and factory-scale production needed to transform housing into a self-sustaining economic engine. Home building times cut in half. Costs down nearly 20%. Emissions slashed through modernized fabrication. The numbers were compelling, but the numbers weren't the point. The true significance was strategic. This wasn't simply about putting roofs over people's heads. It was about ending a structural dependency on U.S. capital, U.S. materials, and U.S. approval. For decades, Canadian growth had been shaped by American supply chains and American investors. Whole industries were built waiting for signals from Washington. Tonight, Carney declared that waiting over .to drive the point deeper. He reached back through history, not as nostalgia, but as context. He spoke of indigenous trade networks that once stretched across the continent, of explorers who carved routes long before America became an industrial power. It wasn't sentimental. It was a reminder. Canada existed, thrived, and traded long before the U.S. dominated the horizon. And it could do so again. Where Trump's nationalism thrives on friction, the idea that every gain is a zero-sum win, Carney's message was almost its mirror opposite. His version of patriotism wasn't loud or defensive. It was rooted in quiet certainty, the belief that a nation doesn't need to shout to reclaim its direction. Then he unveiled a policy that sent a jolt through the financial world. Outsiders had heard the phrase circulating in Ottawa and brushed it off as branding. It turned out to be anything but. What Carney presented was a structural renovation of federal spending rules. Every government dollar, from infrastructure to defense procurement, would now default to Canadian suppliers first, not as a preference. As law. He laid it out with the precision of a systems architect. Build Canada Homes, the Alto high-speed rail project. The National Defense Investment Agency. Every component sourced domestically. Every contract routed through Canadian companies using Canadian labor and Canadian materials. For decades, American corporations had towered over Canadian supply chains, pulling profits northward while keeping control firmly rooted in the U.S. Those arrangements have been accepted as practical, inevitable, even beneficial. Tonight, Carney said, without theatrics, that those days are done. Because once Canada stops importing American materials, Washington's tariff become impotent. A threat only works if the other side still needs what's being withheld. Carney quietly removed that need. In doing so, he erased Trump's leverage. But he didn't stop there. After dismantling the old framework, he offered the country a choice. His tone remained steady, but the weight of the moment was unmistakable. Canada faced two paths, he said. The first was familiar: austerity, adherence to outdated rules, reliance on market forces that had failed to deliver stability for years. The second demanded boldness, massive investment, structural reform, the courage to build rather than wait. One path would preserve comfort. The other would create independence. Carney didn't hesitate. Canada must choose the second path. Then he spoke the three words that crystallized the entire night. Words that will be replayed, analyzed, debated, but never misunderstood. We choose Canada. Three simple words, delivered without drama yet carrying the full weight of a national reorientation. In that moment, every comparison to Washington evaporated. This wasn't about reacting to the United States anymore. It wasn't about retaliating against Trump or correcting his unpredictability. It was about setting a direction so distinct, so self-contained, that American turbulence no longer dictated Canada's future. What unfolded in Ottawa tonight wasn't a budget announcement. It was a declaration, quiet, measured, but seismic. A nation drawing a line, not in anger, but in resolve. A nation stepping out of the shadow of another's decisions and choosing its own path with full clarity. Canada didn't raise its voice. It didn't need to. The message echoed anyway. Across markets, across diplomatic cables, across every corridor where North America's future is debated, Canada will no longer be shaped by Washington's choices. It will be shaped by its own. America's first strategy had always been framed as sovereignty, but tonight the contrast became unmistakable. Two visions, both wrapped in national pride, yet driven by entirely different emotions. Trump's worldview leaned on fear, on the idea that others were exploiting American goodwill. Carney's vision, by contrast, came from belief, the conviction that Canada was fully capable of standing on its own 2 feet. And in Ottawa, before anyone realized what was happening, that belief had become policy. The journalists in the room didn't expect the next turn. A reporter raised a question about New Brunswick's forestry industry, one of the provinces most entangled with the American market. Nearly 3/4 of its exports head south. Billions in revenue hang on Washington's decisions. It should have pushed Carney into familiar defensive territory. Instead, it revealed the architecture of his new strategy. He acknowledged the numbers plainly. Yes, the sector was deeply reliant on U.S. buyers. Yes, the Americans were tightening restrictions. But rather than respond with caution or complaint, he treated the issue as if it were a hinge, one that could swing open a different future. First, he said, Canada would expand domestic demand through federal procurement. Second, it would aggressively diversify its global partnerships. Third, it would reimagine the industry itself, transforming raw materials into high-value exports capable of competing far beyond the American orbit. Every piece of the plan was designed to reduce vulnerability, not feed it. None required permission from Washington. Then came the line that recast the entire Canada-US relationship with almost surgical clarity. We'll negotiate with the Americans, of course, he said, but we're also prepared to do other things they need in exchange for what we need. Simple, precise, devastating. Because unlike Trump, who assumed tariffs worked because the world depended on the United States, Carney understood something far more strategic. Independence becomes leverage. The less Canada relies on American goodwill, the more powerful it becomes in every negotiation. He didn't have to say it. The logic was self-evident. He summarized the change with a phrase that traveled across the room like a steady drumbeat. The United States, he said, had radically altered its interpretation of trade rules, twice repeating the word with deliberate rhythm. The old assumptions, the old NAFTA-era playbook, The old diplomacy, it was all obsolete. Trump may have shattered that system with unpredictability, but Carney had arrived with a replacement. And then he unveiled a number that silenced even the skeptics that $1 trillion investment plan, not a stimulus, not a bailout, a re-engineering of national capacity. The funds would fuel housing, infrastructure, clean energy, artificial intelligence, and sovereign manufacturing. Each sector strengthening the same underlying principle. Canada's economy would no longer drift with the tides of American politics. Carney's delivery stayed calm. He never raised his voice or slipped into drama. He didn't have to. The weight of what he was saying pressed the room into silence. We'll have as many jobs as possible in forestry, he said, but far more in housing, energy, and manufacturing across the country. Between the lines, the translation was unmistakable. Canada would no longer fight for scraps off Washington's table. It would build a new table from the ground up. Then, with almost offhand simplicity, he delivered the line that distilled his entire philosophy. At its core, these are all things we don't have to ask permission for. We control them. We decide. It's our future. No triumph. No theatrics. Just finality. The sound of a leader who had already made a decision and moved on. He closed a reflection that sounded less like policy and more like a declaration of identity. We'll spend less time talking about what the Americans are doing, he said, and more time building this country. It was a subtext, though, that landed the heaviest. Less attention on Trump's tactics, less concern over U.S. unpredictability, more focus on Canada's own momentum. And then came the quiet blow that ended the old relationship entirely. That's the end of Trump. He wasn't predicting the end of a political career. He was announcing the end of Trump's influence, the erosion of the system that thrived on keeping allies dependent and uncertain. Because Carney understands a truth that Trump never grasped. Power doesn't come from making others need you. It comes from needing no one. Trump's leverage had always been built on indispensability. But what happens when a country decides it can function without the very dependency that gave him power? That's a moment when control shifts. And tonight, the shift became irreversible. The policies Carney introduced, Build Canada Homes, the Buy Canadian mandate, the $1 trillion national investment plan, aren't temporary maneuvers meant to withstand a single U.S. administration.